On 6th of August 1945, a US bomber plane takes off from a base in the Pacific. Its target was a prominent Japanese city. Its objective was to bring Imperial Japan to its knees in World War II. And its weapon was one that mankind had never ever seen before. Hello aspiring civil servants. I, Jawwad Kazi, welcome you all to this session on the topic Beneath the Shadows of Hiroshima, Unveiling the Historical Narrative. In this session, we are going to try to understand what ultimately compelled USA to use this weapon of mass destruction on Japan and what was its impact on Japan in the first place and also on international relations back then and what is its legacy continuing forward. So let's dive in and try to understand this topic in detail. Let's get started here. This topic, we are going to follow this particular theme. We will first understand why in the first place Hiroshima is in news currently. Then we will understand the historical context of World War II before the actual bombings took place. Then we will note the strategic considerations that USA had when it decided to use nuclear weapons on Japan. And then, of course, we will talk about the actual bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what impact they had on Japan and on the subsequent international relations and politics. Let's get started, guys. First and foremost, why is Hiroshima in the news in the first place? I'm sure most of you at least would know about what is going on in current affairs. Japan is hosting the annual G7 summit in the city of Hiroshima, which happens to be the city of the current Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kishida. He represents that particular city in the Japanese parliament. And he had invited Prime Minister Modi as a guest to this particular event. The annual summits of G7, they rotate amongst the members and very often important countries are invited as guests over there, and Prime Minister Modi was invited this year too. Prime Minister Modi has also unveiled a bust of Mahatma Gandhi in Hiroshima, and there couldn't be a more fitting tribute that people of Hiroshima could have got. Mahatma Gandhi, who represents peace and international solidarity, his bust was unveiled in this place, which had suffered one of the biggest tragic events in the history of the world. Japan is also holding the third in-person Quad leaders meeting. So this is also another important event that is taking place and India is participating over there. For that reason, the city is in news. The city has been chosen to highlight the importance of the nuclear non-proliferation effort that has been going on for decades. It has registered many successes, but a lot of disappointments also. The current Prime Minister of Japan is very hopeful, optimistic about having some conclusive treaty, some conclusive development regarding non-proliferation. We'll have to see how things unfold in future. Let's take the next slide. Now, we are going to discuss the events or run-up to this very seminal event of bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in that context, let us see what was happening around that period in World War II. Now, in the eastern part of the world, Japan had become a major power in the region. Japan, post the Meiji Revolution, went on to become a modern, nationalistic or ultra-nationalistic kind of a country that was going around dominating other nations in the vicinity. After World War I, this attitude of Japan got even further emboldened as it allied with other European powers like Hitler of Germany and Benito Mussolini of Italy. World War II, for Asia's sake, actually starts from the invasion of China that was carried out by Japan in 1937. Now, Japan has certain limitations. It has limited land, limited human resource and natural resources, and consequently, this group of island-based nation desperately required land and people. And therefore, we see that the Japanese mounted invasions in the territories around them, and China was one of the countries which was at the receiving end. In 1937, the Japanese forces invaded China, occupied its capital of Nanking, and brutally oppressed the people over there. The Chinese, in fact, continue to harbor that grudge about what the Japanese had done to them during that infamous event that is called as Rape of Nanking. Now, what fate befell on China, many others also faced the same outcome. One after another, many areas fell to Japan. The French Indochina, what we today call as Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, they were soon occupied. Siam, Hong Kong, Philippines, Burma also went the same way. Dutch East Indies also capitulated to Japan, and the Japanese were strong enough to even carry out raids right up to Australia. Of course, they could not occupy any territory over there, but nevertheless, they did make strong, bids to attack Australia. So in this sense, Japan was like going through what we call here in India as an Ashwamedh Yajna. There was virtually no opposition to the advancing Japanese forces, and with their advancement came a lot of exploitation, a lot of brutal suppression of the local people. At this point, somewhere in the midst of these events, Japan took a strategic gamble. Japan knew that it is a significant Indo-Pacific power, and the only country at that point of time who could in any way challenge this dominant position of Japan was USA. And therefore, with the objective of preempting any such challenge from USA, the Japanese felt that they should take or seize the initiative and attack the Americans when they were not expecting. By attacking the American Navy and giving it a big decisive blow, the Japanese hoped that they will have sufficient time to carry about their strategic goals in the Pacific. Well, this was a gamble, and they knew that it can backfire, and it did, as we all know. But nevertheless, they took this gamble by attacking the Pearl Harbor of USA in December 1941. This brought the sleeping giant into the war. USA, which until this point was not directly involved in the conflict, now entered the war, and one of its important goals was, of course, to pay back the Japanese people for what they had done. The war, from USA's perspective, now had two theaters. One was the theater in Europe, where Britain and France were beleaguered and Hitler was dominating. And second, an equally important one for USA was the Pacific theater. So this is the story of World War II as USA enters into this war. Now, right up to the mid-1942, the Axis powers, Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan, they were, sitting very comfortable. They had occupied tremendous territory. There was no strong challenge or resistance that they were encountering. And it seemed that the Allied powers, Britain, France, and USA, which had joined earlier, will not be able to unseat them from their position. But all of this started to slowly change from mid-1942 onwards. Hitler's attack on USSR had backfired. The Russians dug in and defended every inch of their soil. And in the process, the Germans lost the flower of their army, and their retreat from Germany started. By mid-1944, Axis powers started to lose ground, and they were driven out of Africa, Italy, which they were not able to then ever recover. Allied powers in the meantime landed in Normandy in June 1944. Europe, which was occupied by the Axis powers, for the first time now faced a significant challenge in the form of a pincer. From the east, the USSR forces were advancing towards Berlin, and from the west, the Allied forces were advancing, and Hitler was caught in between these two. Mid-1945, Hitler realized that his position had become completely untenable. He was surrounded by USSR's troops, and the other Allied powers were not far away. And he knew the war had come to an end for him, and he committed suicide. So the war, from perspective of Europe, was over, but not in case of Asia Pacific. Japan was suffering some reverses at the hands of allies, but it was stoutly defending itself also. It was in no mood to surrender or accept the fate accompli that it was presented. And therefore, the Pacific theater was still active as far as USA was concerned. After the defeat of Hitler, all of these allied powers gathered at a place called as Potsdam. And here at this place, they issued the famous declaration which is called as the Potsdam Declaration sometime in July 1945. In this Potsdam Declaration, three powers, USA, Great Britain and China, gave a stern ultimatum to Japan for an unconditional surrender. They did not give any options for Japan but to accept unconditional surrender. And in case Japan failed to do that, there were very dire warnings that were issued to it. An interesting thing to note over here is that Stalin had stayed out of this declaration. All through the war, when USA and USSR both had joined the Allied side, USA kept on asking USSR to declare war against Japan and concentrate its forces over there too. But Stalin was focused only on defeating Hitler, and he continued to delay this declaration of war on Japan. So after the defeat of Hitler, when the Potsdam Declaration is released, at that point, Stalin had still not declared war on Japan, and therefore he is not party to this declaration. Now, Japan, when given this declaration, objected to the provisions that were there in it. Japan was asked to give up on its imperial government where the emperor was considered as embodiment of divinity. And instead, Japan would have to accept a responsible form of government. So the Japanese government was in no mood to accept this. Second aspect that Japan objected to was occupation of its areas. The Potsdam Declaration wanted Japan to allow the Allied powers to hold on to certain strategic areas within Japan. The Japanese were not ready for this. And thirdly, complete disarmament of the Japanese. The Japanese were a mighty industrial imperialist kind of a power, and therefore it was necessary to defang them. And hence the Allied powers wanted complete disarmament before the peace and reconstruction everything could start. All of these conditions were not acceptable to Japan, and Japan decided to continue its resistance, continue the war as such. Now this made the situation tricky for United States of America. For USA, at this crucial juncture of the war, there were some important strategic considerations. What are these strategic considerations? Consideration number one, USA wanted a quick end of the war in Pacific without loss of American lives. Now, since Japan was resisting, it necessitated that Americans would have to send troops on the ground. And this naturally meant a lot of losses to their soldiers also. This America did not want. Secondly, it did not want the war to linger on longer because the war from Europe's perspective was over and Japan was, the priority for USA. So it wanted a close closure without losses of its soldiers. That is consideration number one. Second, stalling or averting the planned invasion of Japan by Stalin. By the end of Cold War, it was very clear that the differences of USA and USSR could not be reconciled. And the years that would follow or decades that would follow would be dominated by struggle between the two. And in this heightened environment of tension, USA was concerned that Stalin was planning an invasion of Japan, which would mean it would occupy very important strategic areas. So USA wanted to avert this. This is second aspect regarding strategic consideration of USA. Third, establishing strategic advantage in the struggle with USSR. Now, to demonstrate that USA was the numero uno power in the world, it wanted to show the kind of strategic weapon that it had developed. By using and deploying that weapon, USA could easily have a very big lead in this struggle with USSR. This was the third strategic imperative for USA. In the light of these three imperatives, USA decided to go ahead and use the weapon that it had developed. The atomic bomb was developed in a project called as the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a clandestine project for developing a weapon based on atomic energy. Since late 1930s, the scientific research for this kind of a project had already started. From 1942 till mid-1940s, the Manhattan Project successfully developed the atomic bomb for USA to use and deploy. USA demonstrated both the will and capacity to use a weapon of mass destruction in a war. The first one that was used was titled as Little Boy, that was dropped over Hiroshima. Now, why was Hiroshima selected? Hiroshima is an important city of Japan, a very important regional capital. Furthermore, it was a military town and therefore there was a lot of military presence, arsenals, important infrastructure, so on and so forth. And therefore, targeting Hiroshima was logical for USA. We must not forget that while all of this was being planned, Japan was continuously being bombed with conventional weapons. In March of 1945, already Japan had been bombed using traditional weapons, and Tokyo particularly saw lives of several thousand people lost because of these attacks. But since Japan was not surrendering, USA went ahead with dropping off the first bomb on Hiroshima. Now, this then begs the question, why did USA not stop at the first bomb itself? It had killed several thousand people. The final toll went more than 1.5 lakh according to some estimates. And those who survived continued to suffer because of radiation, because of poisoning and many other side effects. But still USA did not stop and went ahead with the second bombing. Why is that so? What is the reason behind that? The reason behind that is twofold. First is on 8th of August 1945, after this weapon was dropped, Stalin finally declared war on Japan. Since Stalin declared this war on Japan, USA naturally felt threatened. USA knew that Stalin wanted to invade Japan and hold territory over there, which was counterproductive for USA. Therefore, on 9th of August, USA once again bombed Japan with a nuclear bomb. In the fog of war, as they say, that was existing at that point of time, the Japanese government did not, officially announce its surrender. The psychological impact of this weapon was so massive that everything was in a complete disarray. And therefore, USA once again dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, which was known as the Fat Man. This second bomb was all the more powerful because it was a plutonium-based bomb and it led to substantial destruction of that particular city. Now, Nagasaki wasn't the original target. It was another port town. But since that target could not be located, the fate came down to Nagasaki and it was attacked on 9th of August. Several thousand people were killed here too, and the survivors continued to suffer because of the effects of radiation and other chemical things. These survivors in Japan today are referred to as Hiwa Kushas. They stand testimony to the effects of a nuclear weapon on the common populace. Now guys, let us see what was the impact of this attack on Japan. After this attack, Japan accepted unconditional surrender to USA. Japanese forces surrendered to General MacArthur in the Pacific, and the war in the Pacific, the Japanese theater, was over. Japan's old imperial constitution, which was drafted in late 19th century, the Meiji Constitution as it was called, it was abolished, and in its place, Japan was given a new constitution. Virtually, this constitution was given by USA's General MacArthur. The draft was given for the Japanese people to discuss and decide, and largely the constitution was shaped on that basis. This constitution gave up on the traditional concept of Japanese monarchy. It was stripped of all the divinity and instead retained mostly in the titular form only. Yes, they do have an emperor, but he mostly represents basically the unity of the Japanese people, and no divine role as such is ascribed to him. This constitution has one interesting provision which is referred to as the Peace Clause. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says that Japan has renounced its right for maintaining its land, sea, etc. borders. So in a way, Japan has given up on the defense aspect of its country. And in return of that, Japan has been made part of USA's nuclear umbrella. Which means if Japan is attacked, then USA will come to its defense. Any attack, a nuclear attack especially on Japan, means an attack on the USA for all practical purposes. All the territories that Japan had occupied in the surrounding areas, all of them were taken away. China had to be evacuated, so was Korea, and all of these were given back to the people to whom they belonged. There's much more complexity to it. We will discuss that in other lectures. Finally, in 1951, when the fog of war settled down, a peace treaty was signed with Japan, but it did not include, once again, USSR. Stalin stayed out of this treaty because the way he was excluded from this Japanese project of USA. Stalin was not informed about the use of nuclear weapons and the subsequent negotiations with Japan. USA had a reason for that. USA continuously said that Stalin never declared war on Japan, and that is why he does not have any say in this affair. Japan subsequently reconciled with this new status and went on to become a natural ally of USA. Today you can see Japan and USA are very, very good friends. All these developments led to intensification of the Cold War. USSR became all the more nervous because of USA's presence in the region. Later, the Korean War added another layer of conflict to this place, and the Cold War was brought to the eastern part of Asia. Hiroshima subsequently became a symbol for anti-nuclear and disarmament movement. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as reminders of the horrors of nuclear weapons. Fortunately, thus far, the weapons have not been used, but the threat remains as long as the weapons are kept stockpiled. And therefore, these events led to development of the non-proliferation regime. From 60s onwards, we see efforts for curtailing and controlling the spread of nuclear weapons start. NPT is entered into in 1968, and subsequently USA and USSR also signed multiple treaties to cap and then later reduce their nuclear warheads. That concludes our discussion for today, guys. Thank you very much. Do join me in other subsequent videos, the details of which you can find on my Telegram channel, Jawwad Kazi Current Affairs. Thank you very much.